very bottom of the social pyramid, and today you have a Dalit chief minister, Mayawati, and she's quite an effective chief minister, and I think she has fairly good control over her state, and she certainly runs her state very efficiently and very effectively. What I'm saying is that this process has taken place through the ballot box. This is social change through the ballot box. It's not a complete social change. We still have a lot of problems, we still have a lot of prejudices, we have a lot of issues, but still, nevertheless, it is a significant social change that has taken place in India over the last few decades, and it has taken place through the democratic process and through the pressure of mass voting in a democracy, and that mass voting leading to changes in the composition of legislatures, composition of people who run the country. You're seeing that in the US, for example. You have the Tea Party there, you have neocons, you have liberal Democrats being sworn under, you've got, all kinds of changes are taking place in the US as well, good or bad. But the same process is at work in India as well. Why I'm trying to tell you this is that this social transformation is a very, very important part of the Indian reality. The reason for that was the inequality in society that was there in Indian society was actually an amazing impediment to the growth of India as a country, and also it was an impediment to the defense of India as a nation. I am sure you're aware that for about a millennia, for about 900 years, India has been under the sway of outside powers, outside people, outside reign. It was the Mughal Empire for about 500 years, 600 years. And then for about 300 years, it was the British, various European empires. Now, so far as the Mughal Empire is concerned, the Indian kingdoms at that point in time were much wealthier than the Mughal kingdoms. They had far more money, far more assets, far more resources. They had better technology. But they were defeated. The question is, why were they defeated? You can have multiple answers. My answer is they were defeated because only about 3% of the Indian population at that point in time was allowed to bear arms and fight in the defense of their country. This 3% was the so-called warrior caste. Nobody outside the warrior caste was entitled to bear arms and to defend the country against the Mughal enemies. If you had a situation in which the entire population was allowed to bear arms, as you have in a modern state, I am reasonably certain that this kind of an invasion would not have succeeded, and this conquest of India could not have succeeded. But where only 3% of the population was allowed to bear arms, the defense became much more weakened, and as a result, it got taken over. Why I'm saying this is that a fair society, a just society, a society without too many privileges and prejudices is very important to the economic, societal health of a nation. Both the United States and India are healthier because a lot of the prejudices of the past, a lot of the privileges of the past have been demolished and destroyed over the last few decades. Both of us are healthier societies, both of us are healthier countries because of that. And you know the history of your own country very well, you know the battles you've been waging there. I wrote, we had this question of racial supremacy, but I wrote some pieces some time ago, some papers, on what I would call religious supremacy. That is saying that a particular religion is supreme over any other religion, and only the people of that religion have certain rights, or the people of that religion have got superior rights to people of other faiths. Now, in some societies, you have a situation in which people of one religion have much more rights than people of other faiths. This is what we could call religious supremacy. In my view, in the modern world, whether it is on ethnic grounds, whether it's on grounds of faith, there should not be this question of supremacy. As is pointed out very often, if you look at this pen, by the way, it's a US pen, which is called the NASA space program. It's supposed to work for 80 years. So I bought it in the expectation that I hopefully will last that long. I'm not sure if I will, but anyway, I got it. So what I'm saying is that we are prone to look, and in fact, Western scholarship and Western literature is overwhelmingly vertical. You have Western society at the top. Then you've got Asian societies, Chinese, everything here. You've got Indian here. You've got other societies. It's continuing from top to bottom. This is a very unhealthy way of looking at society. This is the same to our own caste system. You've got upper caste here, lower caste here, middle caste here, all kinds of stuff. it's far better to look at it in a vertical way. That is, we have different but equal. That an Indian is different from a Chinese is different from a German is different from a Kenyan, but the reality is they are, in a sense, fundamentally equal. That is, you give them certain advantages, give them certain opportunities, and every one of them is going to do as well as anybody else would do in that particular group. So the whole purpose behind the kind of social transformation that we're taking is slowly to change this into this kind of a thing. And that change is not an easy change, because when you have textbooks, for example, that keep talking about one particular culture, one particular civilization, then it's very difficult not to fall into a trap of believing that all wisdom is there in one culture and one civilization, everything else is no wisdom at all. And that is a pretty dangerous mindset. So far as the United States is concerned, I think we in our country, we do feel that the US is actually a quadri-continental country. That is, the US has strong influence of Asia, it's got strong influence of Africa, it's got strong influence of Latin America, it's got strong influence of Europe. But many in the academic community in the United States, in the scholastic community in the United States, the general population of the United States see it as a unicontinental country. Essentially, they regard it as a European country transplanted to the North American continent. It's a part of Europe in North America. So this entire great wealth of the US, the wealth that the culture of Asia, the culture of Latin America, the culture of Africa, this great wealth is in a sense ignored, and there's a concentration of attention on the Europe-US relationship, which has been okay for maybe for the last 80 or 90 years, but definitely in this coming era, in which you have India, in which you have China, in which you have Africa as a major market, Latin America coming up, certainly I think it's not in the interest of the United States, and I think the US should leverage its strengths as a quadri-continental country and understand very clearly that all these cultures are equally strong within what we define as American culture. If you look at dance, if you look at cinema, if you look at music, the great thing about American culture is it has borrowed from all over the place. It's very difficult to identify one particular strain of culture in the US. The overall mass culture in the US is an amazing kind of a fusion of different cultures, of different systems, different peoples coming together, and that is what is making American culture so universal across the continent, across the world. Why it is so easily acceptable is everybody recognizes ourselves in a part of it. We recognize ourselves in a part of US culture. The Europeans recognize part of themselves. The African people recognize part of themselves. And that is, I think, one of the great strengths of this culture, which unfortunately the public have in their culture, but scholars don't yet have in their scholarship. The US scholarship has overwhelmingly implies that the US is basically a European country in America, and geopolitics in the US is we Western people, the Atlantic Alliance, both sides of the Atlantic. So that, in our view, has led the US into some pretty bad mistakes in the past from our point of view. I'll give you a very small example of Asia. Now, in Asia, as you know, 1947, after an amazing amount of effort, as I said, compared to the United States, our effort was much more. It took a much longer time to get rid of these guys than it took for you. But we finally got rid of them in 1947. They left. But at that particular point in time, what was happening in Asia? You had similar movements across Asia of liberation against European powers. You had the Indonesians moving against the Dutch. You had the people in South Asia moving against the British. You had the Vietnamese moving against the French. The Cambodians moving against the French. This was a natural process of the people saying that we will have control of our own lives. Frankly, if you look at the Atlantic Charter, if you look at all that, the United States ought to have been on the side of people who said, this is our life, we have control over it. That is, Algeria is not French, Algeria is Algerian. India is not British, India is Indian. Vietnam is not French, Vietnam is Vietnamese. Indonesia is not Dutch, Indonesia is Indonesia. Unfortunately, because of this unicontinental kind of vision of the US strategic community, the US became, in a sense, along with Europe, they tried to prolong this period of overlordship, prolong this period of European, if I may say so, domination over large parts of Asia. And the result was, for example, wars in Vietnam. The result was problems in Algeria. And a huge lot of problems that caused a perception in Asia that the US was no different from the European colonialists. The reality is, America and Europe are totally different entities. Americans got away from colonial rule. If you look at the history, that's very clear. And I think barring something in the Philippines here and there, there's really no colonial kind of thing that you can attribute to the United States, despite its power, despite its economic strength. But nevertheless, by being together with Europe in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and the 1970s, a perception came in Asia that US is on the same side as the Europeans. Now, why I'm saying this is relevant even today and in the military field. We are talking about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Alliance. Now, NATO is basically an alliance between Europe and the United States to protect Europe in the event of a war from the Soviet Union. There is no Soviet Union. I don't think Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev are daft enough to launch any kind of war, even against Bulgaria. I mean, possibly against Bulgaria. I'm sorry, Sundar. Maybe against Bulgaria or Georgia, but definitely not against certainly not against Poland. Certainly not against Czechoslovakia. But you have NATO. Now, what does NATO regard itself as doing? It's the defender of democracy across the world. In Asia, wherever there's democracy, NATO has to come. In Afghanistan, it has come. In other locations, coming. In Libya, it's coming. The problem here is perception. When American soldiers come in, there is not that negative feeling associated with them, but when they come along with soldiers of a former colonial power, you have a huge negative feeling associated with them. When you hold, for example, a meeting on Libya in Italy, which is the former colonial master of Libya, the Libyan people say, for God's sake, this is colonialism coming back. When you come with the British in Afghanistan, and the Afghans, I can tell you, they killed an amazing amount of British, not because they liked them, but for the very opposite. And they have very nasty memories of the British and very nasty memories of the British rule there. You come along with British soldiers, and Colin Powell says this is a grand thing that we have the UK on our side. To be frank with you, war or modern war is basically about mind space. It is not territorial space. You can capture territorial space for the time being. But unless you capture the mind space, you cannot win that war. And by dragging in Britain into the Afghan war, the US lost an amazing amount of mind space in Afghanistan, with the result that this war is continuing, will continue, and unfortunately is going to go on till such time as NATO leaves Afghanistan. It's not going to stop. Because you are bringing back old memories, and old ghosts are now coming back to life of colonialism. Coming along with the French in some other location, Lebanon. These are frankly avoidable mistakes which we don't see our United States friends avoiding. And why I'm saying that is, again, it is very important to understand